Good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to have you all with us. Thank you for coming in such large numbers. I'm back in town. I think everybody knows that I am back in town. So thank you for joining us on my first day of being back in Serbia after a while. Thanks for joining us for a very special occasion, the discussion on global affairs, what's going on currently in the world. That has been a core line of engagement of the think tank that we have founded a few years ago here in Belgrade, Center for International Relations and Sustainable Development. We started with our think tank's journal, Horizons, Journal of International Relations and Sustainable Development, and we were privileged to have a number of truly distinguished authors writing about various issues that are pertinent to global affairs of today. And one of them is my old friend, Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister, also at times Foreign Minister, and therefore colleague of mine, Foreign Minister of Australia, but more significantly Prime Minister of Australia, a transformational leader of Australia for a number of reasons. He's currently president of the Asia Society Policy Institute in New York, a think tank dedicating to assisting governments and businesses on policy challenges within Asia as well as between Asia and the West. He's also chairman of the Independent Commission of Multilateralism, where in the last 2 years he led a review of the United Nations system. There are many other things that Kevin is doing in his life right now. One is that he's a senior fellow at my own alma mater, Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He's a distinguished fellow at Chatham House in London. He's a visiting professor in Tsinghua University in Beijing, where he's lecturing in fluent Mandarin. And as a matter of fact, he is one of the world's
It's better than my Serbian.
He's slightly better in his Serbian for now. He's very fluent in Mandarin. He's one of the leading non-Chinese experts on China. I think this is not an exaggeration to say that. He's also a co-chair of China Global Affairs Council at the World Economic Forum in Davos. I already said that he served as Australia's Prime Minister, that he was a transformational leader of Australia, but I'd say just a few points that under his leadership, Australia was the only major developed country not to go into recession during the world economic crisis of the last decade. He's also one of the founders of G20, which was established to drive the global response to the crisis, preventing the global economy from spiraling into recession. He was an author of a number of very prominent papers and documents, especially in the last few years. But first and foremost, a good friend of mine, a good friend of Serbia. This is not his first time in Serbia. He's an old hand of European history, a keen scholar of European history. He joined us a few years ago when in the year 2014 we organized a big conference on the 100th anniversary of the onset of the First World War. But today we came to speak about the world in flux, about a world that is going through what I'm sure the future historians, the historians are going to call years of change. A world in which global order has suffered a number of hits, And a number of people that I've been meeting all around the world over the past months have been calling a year of earthquake. So earthquakes are measured on a scale of Richter scale, if I'm not mistaken, of 1 to 9. And if we think of a year that has definitely colored and influenced the world affairs in a very significant way, and that was the year 1989, the year when the Berlin Wall came down, the year when a very important era came to an end, that is the Cold War. If that was a year that one can number 9 on the Richter scale, the highest number on the scale, I'm going to start off this discussion by asking Kevin, if 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall was 9, how would you call the year in which Britain decides to leave the European Union, Italy decides to go against its current elite, its current order, a year in which Donald Trump becomes president of the United States, in which Brazil rebels against its order, if you will, and so many other things. Year 2016, on a scale from 1 to 9 in terms of earthquakes, how would you number it, Kevin?
Well, thank you, Vuk, for the invitation to be back here in Belgrade. And thank you all for your attendance here this evening. On the bold question you ask, the Chinese, as you know, have a curse, may you live in interesting times. I think the times we're living in at the moment are far too interesting. Those of us who've been in international relations for a while prefer things to be less interesting. So on your Richter scale of 1 to 9, and if 10 equals we're no longer here to report back, I'd say we're somewhere in around about the 6 or the 6.5. These are significant forces for change. If what we're seeking to examine tonight is where does the global order go, I suppose the starting point, Vuk, is what is the global order? And I have a pretty simple view of it. It's made up at one level of great power relations, and whether those relations are functional or dysfunctional. At a second level, it's the operation of global institutions, not just the United Nations, but the rest of the institutional machinery of the international order. And then the third level is this great disruptive force of what we call globalization and counter-globalization. Not of itself an order, but frankly, a rolling disruptor of order, both positively and negatively. So you put all those things together, we have huge dynamics impacting on each of them. We have currently a dysfunctional relationship between Russia and the United States. We have a difficult relationship between the United States and China. We have a reasonable relationship for the first time in decades, and in the span of history, hundreds of years, between Moscow and Beijing. And we have, I won't say an imploding Europe, but a Europe which has become more of a seminar than an institution. And so that's kind of at the apex of it. So that spells change, 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 compared with where we were 25 years ago. As for the institutions, the UN plus, I think these institutions are finding themselves in what I describe as global no man's land. They're no longer, in an age where we need global institutions to function at their most effective, they are functioning at their least effective, in part because they've not been the recipients of mandates to act fully in the way in which they should, and at the same time because national governments have been reluctant to give them their mandates to do that. And then underneath it all, you have what I describe as the kind of almost the horticulture of international relations. and that's what globalisation is. We all know where it goes to positively through the great innovations in science, technology, innovation and capital, drawing the world closer together, lifting prosperity. And that's been the narrative for some decades. But now the forces of counter-globalisation are there for us all to see. I'm not, as people opposed to this phenomenon would say, I'm not a recipient of the benefits, I'm a casualty of it. My kids are not going to be as well off as I was. I'm uncertain about my future. I'm retreating to my local identity, national and subnational. And as a result of that, I want to get off this process called globalisation and return to the certainties of national and nationalist politics. And so that's swirling around underneath the dynamics of great power relations and, shall I say, the fractured nature of our global institutions. So for those three sets of reasons, I give the answer of about 6 or 6.5 out of 9. It's not cataclysmic, but let me say there are so many variables at play at the moment that it's of a degree of difficulty we haven't seen for statesmen and stateswomen across the world in many decades.
Well, if we were having this discussion 2 months ago, I'd ask you to start by discussing Brexit. But that's already old news. And probably the hottest topic that people would like to discuss these days, and here in Belgrade, I believe as well, is the election of Donald Trump for President of the United States. This is something that not too many people expected, especially not in the United States. It came about as a surprise to global elites across the world. So let me start off our conversation by debating America post-Trump. And let's not get into discussions as to why did Trump become president and why did everybody made a mistake of projecting Hillary as a winner of the presidential elections. It happened. What happened, happened. Now it's no longer candidate Trump. We now have transition Trump, and soon, in a number of weeks, we're going to have President Trump. So President Donald Trump of the United States and the world order, a very few knowns in this equation. He talked about certain issues. He talked about improving relations with Russia. He talked about viewing China in a very delicate way, let me put it mildly. But what to expect from America of Donald Trump when it comes to, number one, global order, and number two, key bilateral relationships of this decade?
Well, I think your question, obviously, is the question of our days, and it doesn't matter which capital I'm in, whether it's in Beijing or Berlin or wherever, it's the universal question. I was talking to the Chinese just recently in New York who are saying, well, what does all this mean for us? To which I said, comrades, don't worry, we're all in the same boat. None of us know. Confessions are important. My wife and I long have a tradition of guessing the outcome of elections. On Brexit, she won and I lost. On Trump, she won and I lost. And next time we have an event like this, whether it's in France and Germany, I'm just going to shut up. So I'm just owning up front the fact here that my powers of political prediction may be limited. If I run for anything else in the future, she'll be the campaign manager. So let's look at Trump and how it's going to impact on the world. As I said recently in a piece I wrote in all the Australian newspapers, it is what it is. Let's forget the diagnostics as to why it's happened. It is what it is. So how does the world now deal with transition Trump becoming President Trump, as you just said before? I think the first principle the international community should adopt is along these lines. Take a very deep breath, don't hyperventilate, and give the incoming president some time. He's only elected several weeks ago. As you can see through the public process, his cabinet, I should say, is just being assembled. And the history of the formation of US administrations, these are usually full of one misstep or another. I think candidate Trump had no expectation he was going to win. And so the preparations for a transition team were not there. As you know, there are 4,000 positions available in a transition in the United States. For Hillary's team, had the Democrats won, I'm sure there were 7,000 people promised those 4,000 jobs. It's called in politics the art of disappointment. For candidate Trump, I think it's more likely a few dozen. So we are at a point where it will take some time for this administration to shake down. But let's go to some core principles. Look at not the detail of what he has said, because I think we can overanalyze the micro detail. Particularly in an American political system where much is said in campaigns and less is delivered in reality. But let's go to the thematics rather than the specifics. The thematics are that, number one, this guy will be a domestic president. His instincts are very much for the future of his country, and this constituency which he's intuitively identified across the United States, who are what we would describe as the non-beneficiaries of globalisation. Hence his early moves with Carrier, the air conditioning company, which you would have seen, a very small-scale bailout to the tune of $6 or $7 million provided by the state government concern to sustain half the jobs which would have been lost had the plant gone on to move to Mexico. But that, I think, is emblematic or symbolic of a key thematic, which is that he actually believes in his guts, in his viscera, in his heart, that the rules of the international trading system are skewed against the United States. That is a deep conviction. And as a consequence, we are going to see movement on this one way or another. Whether it's the WTO, you've seen the early evidence of this through the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the Asia-Pacific region. I don't think TTIP even gets to first base. The renegotiation of NAFTA, though he promised the repeal of NAFTA. We are seeing a president who has deeply protectionist instincts because he believes the rules of the global trading system have been skewed against Middle America. And that's not just one occasion, this has been said 1,000 times in his campaign. So that's principle number one we should bear in mind and where that takes us. Principle number two in great power relations is, and you don't have to be a rocket scientist to work this one out, he questions why the United States has to have such a bad relationship with Russia.
This is something that is definitely of a great interest here. Do you think that there is a hope for a better relationship between the United States and Russia in the coming years?
I know I'm an Australian, but I understand a little bit of the history of this part of the world's relationship with the Russian Federation and the period which preceded that. And so it's of interest here, but frankly it's of interest globally, what he does with Russia. I think his view is, and here I think, like I don't know, but I think his view is it wise to continue to prosecute the deterioration, the structural deterioration of relationship with the Russian Federation, which makes the rest of the global order increasingly dysfunctional? He won't use those terms. But he will say, why do I need to be an enemy with these guys? What is the reason? These guys have got a stack of nuclear weapons. They have interests, obviously, in the Ukraine, they have interests in Syria, and they have interests elsewhere. So his instinct, I think, is, can I work through this with Putin? For those who think it's a very simplistic deal, which may be on the table, in either of those domains, namely Syria or the Ukraine, it won't be simple. But his instinct is different from the current administration, which is, how can I try and make this relationship work for both parties and therefore for the global order? I think a third thematic, and I'll finish at this one, is I think it is much more likely to be problematic in terms of the future of the US-China relationship. I don't think it's got anything to do with the recent statements about Taiwan and telephone calls and the rest. That's all part of the start-up, if you like, of a new administration coming to office, and one who is, in his case, so distrustful of the existing State Department apparatus, who would normally handle these things. It's because his narrative on the economy in the election campaign, the domestic presidency, about unfair trade rules affecting his country, about what he sees as unfair currency arrangements, are deeply held by him and are visceral. And it is that narrative which directly goes to the core of the US economic relationship with China. Bilateral trade relationship with China is about $650 billion. The trade surplus by the Chinese is in the vicinity of about $300 billion. And so therefore, when he says we in America have lost the middle class jobs in the United States in order to create a middle class in Asia and China, that's his deep being speaking. So I think the real challenge, forget all the national security questions, forget the Taiwan question, will be how does he prosecute the economic relationship with the Chinese?
Well, let me pick on that one, because this is a very, of course, the China-America relationship is believed to be by many people the key bilateral relationship of the 21st century. And he starts off by, okay, forget about everything that he said in the campaign. In the campaign, he talked about China as currency manipulator. He talked about the 45% tariffs that are going to be introduced on Chinese goods and so on. Forget about Trump, the candidate. But we're talking about Trump, the transition guy and soon to become president. This phone call to Taiwan that he made a few days ago, according to public understanding, this is the first time that a sitting president or president-elect of the United States makes a call to or makes a direct contact with a Taiwanese leader ever since 79, I believe, the end of the formal relationship between the ROC and Washington. And we all know that China is particularly sensitive to this when it comes to one China policy, when it comes to sovereignty and territorial integrity, and so on and so forth. You are a great scholar of China. There are very few people in the world outside China that can claim to understand China as well as you do.
I've had more Chinese meals than you, my friend.
Yeah, well, I know. That's why I'm asking this question. What is going on in the head of Xi Jinping and the rest of China's leadership after they realize that that Trump has made this unusual step? Is this something that they see as a signal? Is this something that they see as an opening shot and a bargain and a negotiation that would come to a deal of some sort? How severe the impact on Chinese mentality is this call to Taiwan going to have?
The Chinese have a saying, which I've heard used a lot recently since the election of Donald Trump. Not in the newspapers, it's just what people say. And the saying is just 6 characters. Have we got any Chinese folks in the audience?
No, but say it in Chinese nonetheless.
Okay, 一不变,应万变. And what does that mean? It means the way to handle 10,000 changes is not to change yourself at all. So what, and this comes from traditional Chinese wisdom, when suddenly there appears to be an eruption of fluid circumstances around you, the important thing for Chinese statecraft is to remain solid, consistent and continuing. Of course, there's an underlying logic for that as well, Because what the Chinese are now trying to understand at a level of deep analysis is what in precise terms, as opposed to rhetorical terms, the Trump presidency may mean for them. I was in China 2 weeks ago, and what I picked up from friends across the spectrum was sort of 2 or 3 different sets of perspectives on President Trump-elect. This was just a week or so before the Taiwan telephone call that you referred to, Vuk. Perspective number 1 is this: we Chinese do not like unpredictability. We're a very predictable lot. There are certain certainties about China's view of the world and of itself. We'd prefer to deal with the rest of the world on the principle of certainty. But in Donald Trump, we don't have certainty. And so that causes a level of strategic anxiety. There's a second group in China who I describe as the tactical optimists. The tactical optimists are those who see immediate opportunities for China in the world because of the positions which Donald Trump has taken during the election campaign. They see, for example, with Trump's position on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, an opportunity for them to now take over leadership of free trade or trade liberalisation negotiations in the Asia-Pacific region from the Americans. They look at what Donald Trump has said on climate change and the future of American ratification of the Paris Accord. They see a tactical opportunity for them, having signed and ratified the Paris Accord, to proceed and take leadership for themselves in global climate change, globally from the United States. And other such things, for example, statements by Donald Trump during the election campaign about his unconventional view of American alliances, both in Europe and in Asia. If they don't pay their dues, then why the hell should we do anything for them? And so the Chinese would see a tactical opportunity for that in Asia, not in Europe. So there's that group. But then there's the third group, and I think these are the folks who sit back, think a lot, and have been around for a long time. I call them the strategic pessimists. And the strategic pessimists say, 2 things really worry me about Donald Trump, apart from him being unpredictable. And this was before the Taiwan telephone call. Number 1 is that we Chinese have listened very carefully to what he is saying about the possibility of normalisation with Russia.
The globalization of?
Normalisation of relations with Russia. Because Trump, so this analysis goes, has concluded that Russia does not represent a fundamental long-term threat to American power, most principally American economic power. But that Trump, secondly, has concluded that China does represent a long-term threat for economic power and ultimately military power, given that one proceeds from the other, usually. And furthermore, the Chinese may think, this group may think, that if that was to occur, what then happens in terms of a better relationship between Moscow and Washington, in terms of the flexibility that may afford President Putin in his dealings with China. At present, the Chinese may see this as a less than equal arrangement because they have all the economic eggs in the basket, and the Russians, since the imposition of Western sanctions 2 years ago, do not have as much freedom for manoeuvre. Suddenly, if that US-Russia relationship is, I won't say resolved, but radically improved, it provides more strategic space for President Putin in adopting a much more flexible posture with the Chinese. So I think this is a factor. But the related one is this, and I mentioned it before. What the strategic pessimists worry about is where will President Trump go on what is of fundamental interest to Chinese leaders, which is the future economic growth of the country. Future of trade, his statements on Chinese currency manipulation, and will that possibly result in a trade or currency war, in which case, who would be the biggest casualties from that? My own analysis is both of them. But in terms of China's interest, looking at it purely through their lens, their strategic lens, I don't think they'd want to see that unfold. So there is no orthodox view in Beijing at the moment. The really interesting thing, Vuk, is you go to Beijing these days, you read the Chinese newspapers. the Trump transition and its impact on China is not central news. It's barely discussed. And that's because there is as yet no official line. The Chinese are in watch and wait mode. For the reasons I've just mentioned.
But of course, China's a big deal, not only in the context of the future relationship with the United States and China. That's certainly a very significant part of it. But China's a question. If we want to discuss global order, if we want to discuss global affairs of the 21st century, China's a pretty big deal on its own, not just in the context of the relationship with the new American administration. And you wrote in one of your essays that we were privileged to exclusively publish in Horizons.
Hey, but Vuk, I don't see my picture there.
Oh, because you're there.
Selected
So you're
distinguished authors. Where am I?
Absolutely,
I can
because
see
you're
all these other
there.
guys.
We were picking people who are not going to be sitting in the audience. Your picture is here, 3D and live.
That's good. I just thought I'd get it.
Yeah, of course. I knew that you were going to ask this question. But you said that when China's GDP eventually surpasses that of the United States, and this is going to happen sooner or later, it's probably going to happen within our lifetime. This will be the first time since the reign of King George III, that means around the time of the French and the American Revolution, that a non-Western, non-English speaking, non-liberal democratic state will be the largest economy in the world. Is that still on the cards? Is China going to become the largest global economy? And what do you see in the coming years and decades is going to be China's influence around the world, including in our corner of the world that is Southeast Europe?
My answer to the question about when China becomes the largest economy in the world is not if, but when. And there's a big debate among economists as to when that's likely to occur. And it's not just the different measures of the size of an economy, purchasing power pricing, market exchange rates, etc. But most analysts would see this transpiring somewhere around the middle of the next decade in market exchange rate terms, or towards the end of the decade. What are the caveats to that? Black swan events. And we've been around long enough, and you've been around long enough, even given your tender years, to know what black swan events are. They're utterly unpredictable. There's a couple of those in the Chinese economy. The debt overhang is one. The future progress of the Chinese domestic economic reform program against the constraints of Chinese politics is another. But I've been analysing China for the last 30 or 35 years since I was a kid at university. I have read so many reports about the impending implosion of the Chinese economy over the last 30 to 35 years. I am sceptical about some varieties of wishful thinking in certain parts of the West that China will just internally implode. I don't see that. So I think it will, simply because it's 1.4 billion people. There are 300 million people in the United States. China is already becoming a low middle income country, and basically the eastern third of the country. And Shanghai per capita income is something in the vicinity of about 28,000 US.
Which is pretty big, yeah.
And then you go to the eastern provinces, it's not dissimilar. So I think this is infinitely more probable than not. So if the hypothesis is correct, then the question is, how will China then use its economic power in the world? I don't think the Chinese are wedded to the continuation of every single element of the post-45 order. They will, as Xi Jinping himself has said, want to exercise a new diplomacy, a new internationalism, helping to shape new rules for the future. But I think the advantage in their proposed process for the rest of us is that their proposed process will be arbitrated through the machinery of the multilateral institutions. In other words, bringing about a momentum for change through the United Nations and through the other institutions. So if there is a reform to the rules, then it's not going to be unilaterally imposed. So I think more broadly, that's the way in which the Chinese would like to go. Here in Europe and in southeastern Europe, look, in Asia for the last 15 or 20 years, what you have sensed palpably, including my own period in office, is the growing economic influence of China in my country, which is a G20 economy. It's the 12th largest in the world, but right across East Asia. If you went through the entire map of East Asia up to India, but now including India, China would be either the number one economic partner or number two. Number one for about 80% of them, number two for the remaining 20%. And this means, therefore, that the China factor in the economies of our wider region is huge, even those countries where it has limited stake. Here in Europe, you begin to see the same phenomenon emerging. I do not think this is a bad thing. I would much rather have the Chinese generating more global economic growth than not generating more global economic growth. Can you imagine if China's contribution to the global economy tomorrow was just sucked out? Half of what we currently generate as modest global growth of less than 2% would actually go, because the Chinese, even with their own slowing growth, contribute half of the growth globally. So for Europe generally, and for this part of Europe in particular, I see on balance significant economic advantage.
And how about the One Belt, One Road, the new Silk Road? Everybody is now talking about the new Silk Road, the big infrastructure projects. Chinese call it the greatest endeavor in human history, the greatest infrastructural endeavor in human history that is going to connect the Far East with Europe.
I suppose, Vuk, we'd have to put the Roman road system into current dollar terms and work out what that was like. So.
That's been a talk of the town here in Eastern Europe for a while, given the 16+1 format that China has been engaging with. That's the context in which China has been engaging with the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. What can you say to us about the One Belt, One Road, about the new Silk Road? Is that a reality? When is that going to happen? And is that going to benefit us here in this part of the world?
Let me try and put it in a sort of a wider geostrategic, geoeconomic context as seen from Beijing, and then hazard a few opinions about what it might mean here in Europe. Number one, this is Xi Jinping's personal initiative.
So that's going to work?
Well, last time I looked, this guy had a reasonable amount of political authority in the Chinese government, and he's not to be messed with. But it is a number one priority of the number one leader in the Chinese system, and Xi Jinping will be there for at least the next 6 years. 19th Party Congress coming up at the end of next year, 20th Party Congress 5 years after that. So in terms of its political foundations, it's very solid. Number two, the Chinese see this as an opportunity to engage themselves with regional partners in very large-scale infrastructure development across the Eurasian continent. Their model is pretty simple. That's what they did in China for the last 20 years. How do they develop the Chinese economy? They looked around and said, we don't have decent roads, our railway system's terrible, we don't have enough ports, our electricity supply is inadequate and subject to frequent failure. Until we get that right, nothing else is going to happen in the economy. And so really from about 1990 to 2010, that's what the Chinese did. You go to any city in China, you'll see usually a first-class airport, you'll see often a high-speed rail, you'll see often, certainly, a high-speed road for the transport network, none of which existed on the map 20 years ago. I know, because I lived in China back then. There was just nothing. The previous system was basically laid down 100 years before. So they have this in the back of their mind, that this is the way in which you develop economies, and they have in mind a lot of the unstable areas which constitute the heartland of Eurasia across Central Asia in particular, and in Pakistan and countries like that, whereby adding to infrastructure, they add to economic growth, or they add to economic growth, they enhance political stability over time as well. Geopolitically, the Chinese, of course, will want to see this as extending their influence in the world and extending their influence here. But my net argument about this global infrastructure project which is the One Belt, One Road initiative, and I said this in China recently, is on balance, it's good for the world. One, if you took it out of the global growth equation, global growth would be increasingly sick because there is a lot of investment that's going into this project. In Pakistan alone, somewhere between 50 to 100 billion. That's one country. Now, as we speak, this program was only launched 2 years ago, but now there is a massive set of road, rail and port developments underway in Pakistan. What's happening in Central Asia, I can't give you the precise list. What's happening west of Central Asia as you approach Eastern Europe, again, I can't give you the list. But in net terms, it's going to add to global growth. I think it will also add to aggregate political stability in countries where economic growth prospects, such as in Pakistan, are very thin at present.
So I know that we could be talking about China all day, and it's a great privilege to have such a China expert with us, and China is definitely going to become an increasingly pertinent global actor in the years to come. But we live in Europe, and Europe is our immediate surrounding. We very much, as a nation, feel part of European history and geography and cultural framework. And I think that most people would agree that the future historians are not going to write about this particular period of Europe as the golden period. And there's so many issues that Europe is right now facing. Some call it European crisis, some call it crisis of the European institution, but definitely one can agree, I think, that Europe has had better days in the past. So what's your take on the current European situation, and what's your view on where Europe will be going in the coming years, given all the locomotions, continental and global?
Well, as you know, I'm not a European. I'm just an Australian.
Well, good for you.
And we like Djokovic, by the way. He's won most of his... He's a great tennis player.
Yeah, well,
he's done so well at the Australian Open.
Yeah,
Australians just admire his skill. So
that's good. That's probably the only place where Djokovic is actually playing as on a home court. Australia is a home court for.
But we just take
Djokovic.
our sport seriously because he's so good. We like people who are good at what they do.
I think that's good.
So he's good, and certainly he's been great branding for Serbia around the world. Mind you have done so badly yourself. And after Djokovic, I think this guy will be one of the better-known Serbs around the world after his campaign for UNSG. I mean, coming from nowhere to end up second in the UNSG stakes is quite remarkable. I couldn't even get endorsed by my own government. So mind you, you might have had a few problems on that score as well, but I'm not going to go there.
Let's not get into my relationship with my government.
No.
We don't want to.
I'm not going to talk about
that.
anything to do with Serbian domestic politics. Matter for you folks.
Let's escape into a safe haven of this debating European issues right now.
Most Europeans would not regard that as safe either. But so what I was about to say was, hey, I'm an Australian and I visit Europe a lot. And I spend a lot of time in France, Germany, and in Britain, mainly talking about China and this continent's engagement with China in the future. And I do a lot with the governments of Europe on that question, as well as on UN reform and the exercise I've been engaged in for the last 2 years in producing a document on the future reform of the UN system. So I may not be a European, but I am a Europeanist, if that makes sense. Because the fundamental rationale for the European project, going back to the Treaty of Rome, I believe in. Europeans have been killing each other for 300 years, since at least the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, and for a lot of time before that as well. We all know the history of the 20th century, 2 monumental wars. And the European project was very much about, frankly, putting that to bed at a geostrategic level. We seem to have forgotten the history of Franco-German tensions, which gave rise to so much of what we saw unfold in that period from the end of the 19th century through to the middle of the 20th century. We should not forget these key factors for the future. That's part of the reason I am a Europeanist, because I don't want Europe to turn in on itself and become so nativist it cannot see its great continental opportunities for the future. The second is very pragmatic. If I was a European, which I'm not, for God's sake, you've got this huge market there. I mean, go for it. It's 300 million people plus. You've got enormous market opportunities. Think of us and the New Zealanders on the other side of the world. You know, there's 25 million of us, there's 4 or 5 million New Zealanders, and we've got each other. But we have it now. Since the British joined the European Union way back when, we said, oh, well, that's the end of that. So we're now totally integrated in the economies of the Asia-Pacific region. For those reasons, if I was European, I'd be exercising every piece of political creativity and diplomatic leadership to refashion the European project so it survives.
So basically, you believe that there's a danger that if we don't find a way to refashion the European project, that it's in the danger of not surviving, as a matter of fact?
Well, people say what a relief the Austrian result. The Austrian result was 47% for an anti-Europeanist candidate. Now that Fillon's the candidate for the Republican Party in France, what will be the outcome there? He should win. He should win well. But the fact that Le Front National has a substantial base, what's the ultimate peak that Alternative for Deutschland can reach? I'm not sure. What about the future of UKIP, way beyond the dynamics of the Brexit debate? I don't know. But none of these movements, all of which are now around about the 20% factor one way or the other, apart from the Austrians, which is double that, none of these political movements are in any way wedded to the European project. In fact, they're all committed to destroying the European project. So is that a danger? Well, when I start to see in anywhere a fifth to a quarter of the voter base saying we want out of this, I start to get worried.
So why do you think that there's a growing sentiment in all corners of Europe that people want something different? In the British case, it was like they wanted out, and in the case of Austria, it was not really out, but definitely defiance to the current structures and current ways. In the case of Italy, it was no to the elites and so on and so forth. So why do you think that there's so much festering? Why do you think that there is so much fermentation of anti-European sentiment amongst European nations under the circumstances?
I don't think there's a lot of complexity in the analysis. Everyone says there is, but I'm just a simple Australian, so let me reduce it to a couple of fundamentals as I observe it here and in the United States. And they're different, but there are some commonalities. Number one is this neoliberal economic order we've been constructing together for the last 25 years plus has achieved enormous prosperity for a whole bunch of people and limited prosperity for a whole bunch of other people. And to the fact that we now, for the first time, really since the war, have a generation of folks who don't believe they can hand on to their kids a better living standard than the one they inherited from their parents. And that now is not just the experience of a few people at the margins of the labour market, it's now occupying more central places in the labour market. Larry Summers, the Harvard economist, a guy I got to know and respect over the years, has written a very important piece about 2 years ago on the impact of technology and the revolution in artificial intelligence on normal labour displacement. That is, historically for 200 years since the Industrial Revolution, new machine comes, lose a whole bunch of jobs there, new jobs created over here, often in different cities. It all levels out in the end after some temporary dislocation, and incomes rise. And by and large, people are happy with that. But now with the pace and intensity of labour substitution occurring with McDonald's, for example, all those people at the front of the shop will disappear within the next couple of years as that becomes completely automated. And then, sooner or later, it'll be automated at the back of the shop where they actually make the hamburgers. McDonald's is a big global employer. And so it's not just manufacturing, it's the services industries. So I think we're just at the beginning of this process unfolding in all of our economies. But I think those folks who are missing out now sense that it's going to get harder and harder. Therefore, Marx was probably right in his analysis of what was going on in terms of alienation, economic alienation leading to social alienation. I think Marx was terrible at his prognostics about what to do about it, but his analysis wasn't bad. And so the key then is to understand that this is unfolding beneath all of our feet. So secondly, it doesn't take much creativity for political leaders to come up who are populist to say, here is the problem, I can do something about it, but blame them for what has happened. And I see this dynamic occurring in many, many places, including my own, across the world at present. So what's the answer to this? Frankly, the classical European social contract now has to be redesigned if you're going to sustain it within a liberal democratic model which continues to act as the shock absorber of the system. In other words, what we've had so far as a social contract, which until the 80s and 90s was working okay, but now is not adequate to cope for this massive dislocation occurring in societies, communities, in industries, in firms, in individuals and in families. And if we don't redesign that social contract, then I fear what happens to the democracies which currently house them, let alone the supranational institutions which house those democracies, in this case the European Union.
So my last question on Europe is, you know that Serbia is not in the European Union. We are aspiring to join the European Union. All these locomotions are happening inside the EU. What's your projection like? Is that a workable proposition for us? Can we make it? And if we might make it, when do you think that this can take place?
For Serbia?
Yeah.
I've never worked in Brussels in my life, and it's a mystery to me what happens in Brussels. It's more mysterious.
It's mystery to many people.
It's more mysterious than the Roman Catholic Church, and
or the UN, for that matter.
Oh no, the UN's far more mysterious than the Roman Catholic Church. There are just layers of complexity there. But I would say this: if I was a European, as opposed to just an Australian, I think this whole continent needs to buck up. I find that there is almost a fashionable pessimism within Brussels about Europe's future. Every time I go there, you run into the sea of long faces, and all of whom have a horror story to tell you about what's going wrong. You know, for me, I mean, Europe is a... Can I have your water?
Yeah.
No, the bottle. I don't trust you.
Right.
Yeah, this one. I mean, Europe is the classic glass more than half full in terms of what it's achieved. The geopolitics, no one's killed each other since 1945. And in terms of mass war, which is continental-wide, prosperity, look at per capita income and where it's gone to from 1945 to the present. That's not bad. You've got European environmental standards, which have become normalised across the continent. Yeah, it's not full, and there's a fair bit to go there. But when I look at the Eurocrats in Brussels, they believe this equals three-quarters empty. And it's become fashionable. You sit in a room with a whole bunch of European political types, as I've done a few times recently post-Brexit, and I think I've just walked onto a different planet. I mean, there is so much that's positive happening in Europe on the ground and in communities. We all go through difficult challenges of structural adjustment of the type I've just referred to. But it's not beyond our collective wit and wisdom to deal with new structural challenges. And so for Serbia, I would think it's a project worth supporting, worth joining, and in terms of Brussels, whenever they have the political space in terms of their priorities to accommodate further expansion, then I would hope that you guys would be near the head of the queue.
Well, thanks for that. And I wanted to talk to you about a whole range of other things, but I'd like to give now an opportunity to the audience to ask questions about everything you can think of in the world. Kevin is a generalist and a specialist of foreign affairs, so you have an opportunity to ask. So the first question goes to the gentleman over there.
Good day, and thank you for taking your time to be with us here. My question to you would be, how do you see the relationship between China and the Philippines developing in the foreseeable future? And in the other words, are we witnessing a genuine shift in Philippines' foreign policy, or is it just a show of force, a show of defiance towards the United States? And is such a genuine shift even possible, taking into account the long-standing South China Sea dispute going on between China and the Philippines? Thank you.
President Duterte of the Philippines is an interesting sort of guy. You would have seen his approach to law and order, which has unique characteristics. He's the first, this is quite interesting, he's the first president of the Philippines not to come from Manila. He's the first mayor to have actually become president of the country. Practically everyone else has come from the city elite, either the economic, foreign and security policy elites, back to Philippines independence from the Americans just after the war. Secondly, there is an understandable Philippines resentment over the US colonial period. I mean, the Americans usually say they never colonized anybody in the world. Well, the Philippines was a notorious exception going back to the days of Teddy Roosevelt and the Spanish-American War. And that has actually left quite a deep impression within Philippines' political consciousness. The Spanish who preceded them as colonial occupiers were much worse in the Philippines' collective memory, and that went on for hundreds of years, 400 years. So the Americans were 50-year interlopers, but these things have an impact on the consciousness. Often Europeans, when they look at Asia, don't understand one thing. If you have been colonized by Europeans for 400 to 500 years, think of yourselves in the same circumstances, and how would you feel? So when you look at these high civilizations and cultures, such as China, such as Vietnam, such as Indonesia, such as India, and such as the Philippines, I mean, for me it is no mystery that these countries are resentful of a very long-standing, overbearing colonial past. The final point about the Philippines is this. I think Duterte is a very pragmatic guy, and he will be out to obtain the best deal that he can get out of China, out of Japan, you would have seen his bilateral visit to Tokyo after he went to Beijing, and out of this new administration in the United States. If President Trump lowers the bar in terms of his expectations of human rights performance by American friends and allies around the world, then there are grounds for a reaccommodation with the Duterte government as well.
Thank you. Sir?
Yes, thank you. Mr. Rudd, nice to see you here. My name is Marat Terterov. I'm your fellow Australian, but...
How'd you end up here, mate?
Well, at the invitation of this lady here, in fact.
Did you marry him?
No, I'm going back to Brussels tomorrow.
Oh,
I've been living in Brussels for 8.5, nearly 9 years, which actually brings
You've always got to ask what Australians are doing in Europe, just in case it's something bad.
Indeed. And I actually saw you speak when you were Prime Minister in March 2008 in Brussels at one of the think tanks, which I think you gave a very good riposte of the fellow from the WWF, I think it was. He gave a critique of some of the issues that you were addressing on global coal issues and that sort of stuff. But you actually partially answered my question which was actually, what has Europe done wrong to get it to this state of affairs, which I think is a very relevant question for this audience, because this country is officially on a kind of European accession path. But I'd like possibly to explore with you what Europe could actually do a little bit more for those bureaucrats to kind of smile a little bit more, to a little bit more lively. Bearing in mind that we have the High Priest of Europe, your photo is not here, but the High Priest of Europe, Jean-Claude Juncker. But what could Brussels be doing more to get it back on the right track? The laudability of the European project, which you talked about, is well received by European, sort of populations, maybe less the Brits, but generally continental European. So where could they start to reform? Is it actually Brussels itself, the way it functions? I mean, I've been there for 9 years. I don't work for the institutions. I work for the Energy Charter Treaty, an international legal protection regime for energy investments, which Australia is a member of as well. But, or is it with the member states? I mean, is it really in the council? So perhaps you could explore that issue. Thank you.
Look, I'll make just two very broad observations because I'm sure everyone wants to talk about a whole bunch of things this evening. One is going to member states. The easiest thing in global politics to do is to blame a supranational institution for what decisions are taken. The European pastime is to blame Brussels for everything. My wife was unhappy with me this morning, blame the European Union. My kids have been misbehaving, blame Brussels. And so I travel a bit and I see the same narrative in the discourse, even though I don't follow most of the languages when I travel. And there's a cumulative effect on this. The cumulative effect is the delegitimization in the publics of wider Europe of the European Union itself as an institution. That's a conscious political choice by European national political leaders. Okay, I'm going to take a decision here. Who can I accord responsibility to for the bad elements of this decision? Blame Brussels. That just accumulates. And there comes a tipping point, there comes a cracking point where, frankly, the credibility of the institution begins to shatter. So national leaders in Europe have got to own responsibility for that. Vuk and I know this very well in our recent engagements with the United Nations. So easy, particularly the United States, just to blame the UN for anything. And it is not uncommon in many parts of the world. But the cumulative effect of that over decades is that the United Nations is seen negatively in the lens of global opinion, as opposed to actually doing a whole bunch of really positive stuff out there in the international community, which is largely invisible to global public opinion. As for Brussels itself, my generic comment would be this: do many things well, do not do a huge number of things badly. There is something to the critique advanced by some of the Brexiteers about the sheer scope of the European regulatory overlay. And it may be that wisdom lies in a better compact between what Brussels does and what national governments do, so that the allocation of responsibilities to Brussels is not one of rolling encroachment of national responsibilities. Easy to say, hard to do. But I think if you got those two things right, you'd have a better future, apart from serving Australian beer in the bars of Brussels, which would cheer people up much more.
Kevin, Europe has, it still is 28 member states, and presumably it's going to go down to 27 in a couple of years from now when Britain leaves the European Union. In 5 years from now, what do you project? If you were to make a bet on how many member states of the European Union there are going to be in the year 2022, what would be your bet? Which number? If you could bet on one number, right now it's 27 presumably, what do you think it's going to be?
I think once the sound and light show of, let's call it the annus horribilis of 2016 is done, that is, all the bad things that have happened in this year, and once the dust settles and people look through the smoke and see the fundamentals of the advantages of European accession and of the institution more broadly, The current 28-27 is likely to grow to around about 30.
In 5 years?
Yeah. And don't ask me who, don't ask me how, don't ask me where, but I don't think you're going to see fracturing, further fracturing. I think also the British separation, I get into dangerous territory here, is more likely to be difficult than not from a British perspective. You know, the basic issue is common movement of people, common movement of goods and services. The British hope is that you can have common movement of goods and services and not have common movement of peoples. Brussels won't accept that. The major states of Europe won't accept that. And so this is going to be, on the balance of probabilities, quote, a hard landing. And so therefore the idea that somehow Brexit, if it's negotiated softly, will create this opportunity for people to have a range of opt-outs for Europe, I don't think is going to be transparent as a consequence of the British experience. So I think with a bit of luck politically, in terms of Germany and France, if Fillon wins in France, if Merkel is returned in Germany, and you have strong European leadership there, then with some leadership elsewhere, I think the project can be reconstructed. But the anchor for its reconstruction lies in this deep alienation at local community level, which people feel usually from their national governments because of the dislocations occurring in the economy and the workplace as a consequence of the huge transformations driven by technology.
Now you understand why we had to bring the Australian in order to bring in some optimism into the fold.
It also helps that it's summer down home at the moment.
Thank you for that. Europe growing to 30 means that 3 of the 4 countries Serbia, Bosnia, Macedonia, and Albania, 3 of those 4 would have to join the European Union. That's a great degree of optimism, and I'm grateful.
But remember that in Brussels, they will want to be seen as being optimistic after the British experience. They want to actually demonstrate that the project continues. And the countries you've just referred to, including your own, don't represent
I forgot about Montenegro, I'm sorry.
50s and hundreds of millions of people.
So it's not that big of a mouthful to digest.
And I think they want to demonstrate at a political level that it's ongoing. That's assuming you can get the fundamentals of France and Germany working again in terms of the European project. They want to demonstrate its success and demonstrate through the negative example of Britain's exit that there is no cheap option to be, as it were, a side member.
Well, that's a reason to be optimistic. Thank you for that. How about other questions, sir?
So, thank you for a very interesting conversation. I'm intrigued by the reference you made to renegotiating the social contract. Many service jobs will disappear. The flip side may be very cheap goods and labor, very cheap goods actually, which means you may not have to work as much in the future.
Speak a little bit louder, I think.
Yes. So, but could you develop your thought on renegotiating the social contract? Because I think that's a fundamental issue. Thank you.
Well, you're right, my friend. The question about is how do you renegotiate a social contract? You may have people who are losing jobs. As you know, Europe really hasn't recovered fundamentally from the crisis of 2007. And you've only just recently had the European unemployment level dip below 10, and that is with decreased participation rates as well in the European workforce. And as you head further south in Europe, those numbers increase, as you're all too well familiar. So this is about to become a decade-long process, like a decade-long phenomenon. And that's quite a long time in politics. You're right that globalisation, largely per medium of cheaper Asian imports, has produced shirts, ties, clothes, cars, etc., which are historically, in real dollar terms, real euro terms, cheaper than they've been for a long time. It's one of the reasons why I've been, as a social democrat, a strong proponent of free trade in my own country, and together with other Labor Party leaders brought the trade union movement with us to embrace that, because cheaper goods and services for working people was going to raise their effective living standards, even though it would mean structural adjustment in terms of the industries they worked in the future. So I get that logic, and I certainly do not argue any form of protectionism as the solution to that. What I am concerned about is the beginning of what serious, credible economic theorists such as Larry Summers are pointing to, which is the quantum shift, which we are now beginning to embrace in the non-return to the labour market of a lot of people who have lost their jobs since '07, and with automation cubed, and if you like, robotisation, artificial intelligence on the way, the substitution effect that we have known for 200 years is going to start to disappear. So when I talk about the redesign of the social contract, we're going to look at people who will perhaps never enter the workforce in a formal sense. How do we redesign our concept of work and social responsibility and solidarity and productive participation in the society in large to accommodate that without becoming Luddites, which is we're just going to put a hammer through this new machine because it's destructive? Because even if we do that in Serbia and in Australia, I know for a fact they won't do it in China. They'll put that machine in and they'll produce even cheaper shirts and the rest, which is good, but frankly, in their own country, they're embracing the same challenge. The automation of Chinese plant and equipment now is causing a hollowing out of Chinese manufacturing and manufacturing jobs. Tens of millions.
Great. Sir.
Good evening, thank you. My name is Philip and I'm an economics student here from Belgrade, Serbia. I think I'm speaking for all of us here when I say we're honored to have you here tonight. And my question for you is, what do you think the implications for the potential new US-Russia relationship are going to be for Europe, especially the European Union, concerning the sanctions for Crimea and so on? I would like to hear your opinion on that.
I'll be very brief in my response to that because it builds on some of my earlier remarks. It's a bit like Joanne Lyer's response to the question what he thought of the impact of the French Revolution. It's still too early to tell. But I mean that in a real sense with Trump. We actually don't know the terrain of what will be his negotiating parameters with Vladimir Putin on the outstanding questions, which are Ukraine, Crimea and the East, 2, Syria, 3, ballistic missile defence systems, 4, financial sanctions. There'll be other matters as well, but those 4, I think, will be core to any discussion. I do not know, nor does anyone I speak to in Washington, because I live in the United States now. I'm in DC quite a lot. I don't think anyone there credibly knows what the parameters are that he will take to those negotiations, which is why I went to a broader observation earlier on, is that his instincts take him in the direction of trying to negotiate a better pathway for himself, the United States and Russia for the future. The translation of that into the post facto reality, I don't know, and therefore it is too early to tell. I found interesting what Chancellor Merkel said just after President Trump's election, which is that Germany, consistent with European principles, would maintain its policy of current engagement with Russia. I think Chancellor Merkel was being pretty clear and pretty direct about what she saw as limits to the possibility of this normalisation with Russia, but we still don't know which way Trump and his advisors are going to take it. Remember also, we've not touched on this at all this evening, the central focus on Trump in foreign policy in this campaign, and by his new National Security Advisor, General Flynn, is the campaign, the war on terrorism against ISIS, ISIL, Al-Qaeda, Daesh and the rest. This will be the principal lens through which they view their strategic partnerships around the world. How that evolves and changes in terms of great power relations, will they be seen as ends in themselves or means towards dealing with what he identifies as central challenge number 1, which is Islamic terrorism, as he defines it, remains to be seen.
I'm going to, okay, one question, provided it's brief, and then I'm going to use the prerogative of being the moderator to ask the one last thing to Kevin Rudd. So, sir, over there.
Thank you. My name is Andrej Kapitanovic, and my question is the following. Do you see a potentially bigger role for China in the Middle East as a potential stabilizer, and what is the Chinese perspective on the Middle East at all? Thank you.
The answers to that are no and bad.
that it?
I'll elaborate in 2 or 3 sentences. My Chinese friends, when they look at the Middle East, their strong preference is to be friends of all and enemies of none. Most of us who have some familiarity with the terrain of Middle Eastern politics know that that can become problematic, not just in terms of the fault lines between the Gulf states and Iran on the one hand, but more broadly, given the complex intersection of interests in Syria and in Iraq, and in the broader Middle East also in the question of Turkey. Which brings me to the second point in answer to your question was, when they look at the Middle East, they say to themselves, why would we want to have a collective security responsibility for that mess? And so their attitude is, no thank you. So when people often assume in an abstract analytical environment that there's China, rising China, growing its navy and all the rest of it, that it's automatically going to fill a security space in the wider Middle East, I do not think that is credible. China's de minima interest, and probably its de maxima interest, is to secure its sea lines of communications to the Gulf because of its high and continuing dependency on Gulf oil and to some extent LNG. Qatar, Saudi, the UAE, etc. But there's now diversification on that. Oil out of course, the Russian Federation, natural gas out of Australia. We supply more LNG to China than Qatar, than the Gulf does, and prospectively out of Canada as well. So I think it's not a grand concern. The Chinese are much more concerned with their 14 neighbouring states and the immediate strategic environment of East Asia and the West Pacific.
So I'm going to ask the last question, which, I mean, we haven't really touched upon it almost at all this night. And it's about the United Nations. And I was involved with the UN and recently, and you were involved with the UN as Prime Minister and as the chairman of the Commission on the Future of Multilateralism. And I participated in the race for Secretary General, and unfortunately you haven't. And that was a very special set of circumstances. But
it's called politics. Yeah.
It's called politics. Well, some people believe that we have a pretty bad government, but there are worse governments in the world when it comes to the UN. So can you tell me, now the election is over, and we have Antonio Guterres. He's a Secretary General-elect. He's going to assume office in January when we're going to have a new administration. There are lots of challenges that he's facing, including the fact that Donald Trump's not a great believer in the UN. He's not a great believer in climate change and all that. But is there a future for the United Nations? Is it still a relevant institution for our lifetime? And where do you see the development of multilateralism as a concept, and the UN in particular within that context?
That's a hard question to end the evening on. I can't think of a lot of ready jokes to lighten up your evening as you head off into the night. I think the debate about the future of Europe is analogous to the debate about the future of the United Nations. There is excessive collective pessimism about both sets of institutions. Both are under deep challenge, but ask yourself this question: what would Europe and the world look like in the absence of the EU and the absence of the United Nations? It's always critical, I think, in our debate about international politics to always ask counterfactual history, which is, if not the UN, then what would it be? And so when I look at the UN across the spectrum of 70 years, I look at a whole bunch of achievements, not least of which is this thin blue line called international law, which by and large separates us from total global barbarism. We can point to the massive examples where barbarism now occurs, and they do exist right now, as we speak in this room in Belgrade this evening. But if we were to contrast that with the events of 39-45, contrast that with the events of 14-19, contrast that with the horrendous history of European colonialism, and the largely unwritten accounts of the brutalisation of billions of people in the developing world, frankly, this isn't bad against what we once had. As Dag Hammarskjöld, I think one of the great UN Secretary Generals, said, the purpose of the United Nations is not to deliver us heaven on earth. It is simply to save us from hell. And it's important to have that sort of fundamental, pragmatic, de minima view of what this system is able to do for us. Secondly, since 1945, we've evolved something like 700 plus international treaties, conventions, regulation, laws, which covers everything from the International Telecommunications Union, the International Postal Union, through to ICAO, through to how we apply and deploy peacekeeping operations across 22 different missions in Africa. Now, that is called the machinery of global cooperation and collaboration. It did not really exist before 45. So on a before and after comparison, the League, for example, in its limited 20-year history, prosecuted about 30 different international treaties, most of which ended up being violated. So does international law solve all international problems? No. Does it actually manage most international problems? Actually, yes. So the challenge for the future is not to say, as a statement of fashion and fashionable pessimism, yeah, I'm bored with the UN. Let's just get rid of it. Let's do something new. In this post-factual, post-modern society in which we all believe, where our collective memory span goes back about 45 minutes, and actually understand where we've come from for 70 years, which is not bad. However, and the big however is this, my friend, which is why you put out a solid platform for UN reform, and that's one of the reasons why I think you did so well in the race and coming in at second when no one thought you could. And why I've been engaged in a parallel exercise on UN reform for the last 2 years as well, is that unless we address 3 to 4 core areas of future challenge to the system, which is preventing rather than responding simply to conflicts when they arise, preventing crises rather than just responding to crises when they arise, and secondly, embracing fully what I describe as the dull, boring machinery of implementation of global decisions once made, rather than just moving on to the next topical project. If you get a culture of implementation, for example on the climate change deal, a culture of implementation around sustainable development goals, a culture of implementation around chemical weapons convention, plus a new culture of prevention rather than reaction, and institutionalise those effectively within the way in which the Secretariat of the UN actually works, then I think we can save this show for another generation. That's the UN. I'm confident with Antonio Guterres that we've got a man who can do that. He's a passionate believer in the UN system. He has political skills, having been formerly Prime Minister of Portugal. And I think he will be able to handle the complexity of this agenda, notwithstanding the new unknown variable, which is the Trump presidency, barely a 2-hour train ride to the south of Turtle Bay in Washington, D.C.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin. It's been really an exceptional wrap up of global affairs. We touched upon a lot of issues from America to Asia to the Middle East to the UN. Sadly, we haven't had a chance to talk about Africa and Latin America, which are another important topics. But it's been a very fruitful, I'd say educational, at least for me. I hope majority in the audience would share this opinion. Educational evening. I want to thank you for joining us. And this is one in a long series of events that we plan for the coming months and years, if we're all alive and free. So thank you very much for joining us tonight, and join me in the round of applause to thank our guests this evening.
And just before you go, a word from me to breach all protocol, because the guest is never supposed to speak last. This magazine, Horizons, I think Vuk's done remarkably well with this. If you read it, this is quality international relations literature. And I would commend what you've done out of this city, Belgrade, through that magazine and through your think tank, because it's actually qualitatively contributing to the international debate at a time where we need qualitative thinking. Thank you.
Thank you.